Presenting, good practice. Mute when you're not talking. Johnny's muted at the moment. He's giving his thoughts, but he's also muted at the moment. So that's great practice, especially if you might have a little bit of background noise creeping in from your end as well. Plan the start of your section. Avoid dead ends. Pause before you answer. There's no issue with silence, especially when you're doing everything on a pre-recorded basis. So if you want to think about what you're going to say next, if you want to think about how you're going to answer a particular question as a guest, if you want to think about how you're going to phrase your next question, how you're going to bring in the other topic by perhaps offering offering an anecdote to whatever the guest has just said. If you pause for that 10 seconds and you phrase what you're going to say a little bit more effectively, it's so easy to edit out those 10 seconds. If you say and if you start saying the same thing maybe 3 different ways before you actually get on with how you're going to say it, then that's a lot tougher to edit out and may not be possible to edit out completely. People speak in bursts and silences. Now, this is particularly relevant for people that really want to script everything they're going to say. If you script everything you're going to say, then the chances are you'll probably write the script in the same way that you naturally write something. And people don't write in the same way that they speak. If you write, you'll write in whole sentences and you'll have fairly long sentences. But if you try and read out those whole sentences, you'll sound a little bit robotic. So ideally, if you're going to script things, ideally you wouldn't, but if you are going to script things, then try and write in bursts. What does writing in bursts mean? People have pauses in places when they speak where there aren't any full stops or commas. So I had a few different pauses there as well in unnatural places, and people pause for emphasis. People pause to think about what they were going to say. People pause to breathe, and it's part of natural conversation. So think about where you want to put that emphasis and have those pauses, and it's not necessarily where full stops and commas are. Listener, not listeners. A wise man called Terry Wogan once was asked, how do you cope with having 9 million listeners every morning to your breakfast show? And he said, I don't have listeners. I have a listener. I talk to my listener. And I have a conversation with my listener. And that's exactly what a podcast listener feels like. I think it's 79% of people consume a podcast on their smartphone. And if they're doing that, the vast majority of them are going to be alone. And if you're alone listening to something, it's quite a personal medium and you feel that you're part of the conversation. And if the host starts saying, and what do our listeners think? Then that's a lot more impersonal than the host saying, and you, dear listener, do you agree? That's that little bit of personal touch, that little bit of relating with the listener. Episode, not podcast. Funnily enough, a lot of people, when they're talking about an episode, use the word podcast. A podcast is a series. A podcast is what people subscribe to. An episode is an individual episode within the podcast. So when you're talking about an episode, please say podcast episode or episode, as opposed to, I'm really enjoying this podcast. Because it's a bit confusing then when you use the word podcast. Do you mean an individual episode? Do you mean the series as well? So just say podcast episode or episode rather than podcast. And add an anecdote before asking a follow-up question. I touched on this as well, but I think it demonstrates good listening. I think the way that a lot of people don't do a great job of interviewing someone is by having a set list of questions and waiting for the guest to finish answering the question and just getting straight to the next question and not thinking of any follow-up. I think either the guest says something that's particularly interesting and you ask a follow-up question in relation to what they've said, or you pick up on a particular aspect of something about what they said, and you provide your own anecdote in relation to that. And then you blend that anecdote into your follow up question. So it's like part of a conversation instead of just you standing there with your clipboard and your list of 10 questions that you've got to ask before the episode's finished. Presenting bad practice, integrated ums and apologies. So there are different types of ums. If you ever have a look at your own voice recording in waveform, then there are individual standalone ums, and there are ums that are more likely to be at the beginning of sentences or in the middle of sentences, or even worse, at the end of sentences. A standalone is relatively easy to edit out and can be and probably should be edited out most of the time, especially if it's quite repetitive. An integrated as I call it, is part of a word. That's interesting. So if someone says it like that, and it's a part of the waveform, if it's edited out, the word sounds a bit choppy and you feel like you're missing something. So it shouldn't be edited out. So try not to have so many integrated ums because they can't really be edited out well. And don't be overly polite. A big issue with British people. British people tend to be too polite. Many people typically say things like to every single answer the guest says, well, that's interesting. Would you really say that if you're having a one-on-one conversation with that person? What the listener wants to do is perch on your shoulders as you're having a one-on-one conversation and feel that they're involved in the conversation. And if you're having what sounds like a one-on-one conversation, do you always say when someone says something to you that that was thoughtful and well thought out, do you keep on saying that was interesting? Oh, thank you for sharing that, and then moving on to your next talk? It's boring and it's annoying for the listener. Stop being polite and get straight to your point. And finishing every point with an or so. That's a little bit of a crux as well. And it's a bit of a lack of confidence in speaking. Try and speak to the end of your sentence and then have silence. And if you do that, then you'll be coming off as a lot more authoritative, and it'll be a lot easier for your podcast editor at the same time. But if you finish with an if you and I really think that that people should be using this microphone. Yeah, if you finish like that, it's not authoritative, and it's not a signal to your guest or whoever's interviewing you that you've actually finished speaking. So it's difficult for them to know whether or not to come in. So be authoritative, speak with confidence, and don't end sentences with if possible. Presenting, fixing mistakes. Remember the context of where you were before. So this is talking about if you really have to make an edit. So generally, is not a great idea to be editing a podcast episode and re-recording a section of it, because naturally you're going to be in a slightly different environment. You're going to have a slightly different amount of passion, and you're going to sound significantly differently, no matter how hard you tried compared with the original recording. But if you have to do it, remember the context of where you were before. Remember what you're saying. Remember how you were feeling. Have a listen to how you said it before doing the section that you're doing again. And pause and restart with the same phraseology as well. So yeah, have a think about how you were saying something. Make it as natural as possible to link together, and maintain the same pace and passion as well. So that's to do with what I've said already, and it's a way of trying to ensure that the sections sound similar, although they're never going to be completely the same.